Hello, and welcome to the Scott Mize Show, a podcast focused on health, diet, bodybuilding, and philosophy. I interview experts, doctors, coaches, and N=1 case studies to answer your questions about improving health, achieving your best physique, and making sustainable progress. We'll cover topics from carnivore and ketogenic diets, to bodybuilding, to life philosophy, and everything in between. Enjoy the show. This episode is brought to you by Optimal Carnivore. Do you struggle to eat organ meat? Optimal Carnivore was created by carnivores for carnivores. Long-term listeners of the show will know I'm a huge fan of supplementing a carnivore or ketogenic diet with organs. Organs have bioavailable nutrients that you can't find anywhere else. Not everyone finds they have to eat organs on a carnivore or ketogenic diet, but many have found benefits, including myself. And Optimal Carnivore is a great supplement if you are not willing or able to cook organs, you can't stomach them, or if you're traveling, and it's just something that you can easily take, and it's very high quality. Their organ complex is from grass-fed animals in New Zealand. It includes 9 different organs. They also have a beef liver product, a brain nourish product, all of which I've tried and used regularly. Taking 6 capsules is the same as eating an ounce of raw organ meat from the butcher. So super easy. And you can get 10% off your order and other special deals by going to optimalcarnivore.com/Scott. That's optimalcarnivore.com/Scott, and go there to help support the show and get your organ supplements. Dr. Chris Knobbe is a physician and ophthalmologist turned nutrition researcher, and his focus has been on processed foods and particularly seed oils and high omega-6 diets as the primary drivers of overweight and chronic disease. He's been investigating this for nearly 10 years and presenting and published on this since 2016. Dr. Knobbe's book is titled The Ancestral Diet Revolution: How Vegetable Oils and Processed Foods Destroy Our Health and How to Recover. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thanks for having me on, Scott. It's a pleasure. I appreciate it.
Yeah, likewise. I've heard great things about you and your research, and I'm just excited to learn more. How did you first become interested in this area and branch out from being a physician and ophthalmologist to venture into nutrition research?
Yeah, Scott. So I came into this out of my own suffering, and really that for me was it's actually probably several things that were all mostly nutrition related, and but it was ultimately the primary problem for me was arthritis, and it began when I was about 33 years old. And I just, had a progressive case of worsening arthritis that involved eventually most all the joints in my body. And by 2011, I was in absolute misery. And a change in my diet towards paleo had a huge impact on that. And I read Lauren Cordain's book, The Paleo Answer. And for the first time, which was 21 years after I'd graduated from medical school, I understood that processed foods, mostly refined flours, sugars, and vegetable oils, trans fats are driving all of this chronic disease. And I absolutely had never understood any of that before whatsoever. And so this literally just between the improvement in my arthritis and reading his book, it changed my life and set me on a whole new path to try to understand nutrition. And eventually, Scott, I hypothesized that the same foods might be driving, the same processed foods, that is, might be driving age-related macular degeneration, which is the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 50 now worldwide. And that condition is it has caused severe vision loss and blindness in more than 14 million people, bilaterally blind worldwide. The condition, though, affects around 200 million people today and is expected to be 288 million by 2040. And so I actually left practice in 2015 to pursue this full time, based on that hypothesis that processed foods might be driving age-related macular degeneration, because orthodox allopathic medicine pegged genetics and aging as the primary causes of this disease, like they do a lot of things. And anyway, so we looked at data in 25 nations, and all of that data supported the hypothesis that processed foods, particularly the highly polyunsaturated vegetable oils, were driving macular degeneration. And so I went public with that in 2016. And by 2018, 19, as I continued to research, Scott, I was continuing to link the highly polyunsaturated vegetable oils, which we might just call seed oils, as the primary drivers of overweight, obesity, and all of the chronic disease, essentially coronary heart disease, strokes, cancers, type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, Alzheimer's, dementia, macular degeneration, as I mentioned, all the autoimmune diseases, and the list goes on. And so I just felt like this was not being, properly represented anywhere in the science, particularly outside of a couple of colleague researchers that were going down this path. But anyway, so I just felt like there was a big need for me to go, to investigate and go public with that as well. And that's what I started doing in 2019. That's what I've been doing, So a lot of my research over the past 7 or 8 years really has been linked to seed oils and chronic disease.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Both my parents suffer from very intense rheumatoid arthritis, and it's been a huge pain point for them. They've had multiple knee surgeries, hip surgeries, constant wrist pain, foot pain. It's very tough to live with.
Yeah, another one of those. It's when you get into the autoimmune disorders, they're exceedingly complex. But the reality is that even those disorders, the evidence is a little less clear with those, but even those disorders, the autoimmune disorders, were definitely bordering on very unusual to rare in the 19th century, when we didn't have all of these foods. And the evidence is definitely not as strong as it is for coronary heart disease, for diabetes, for macular degeneration, Alzheimer's, dementia. Those conditions we know were exceedingly rare in the 19th century and have all increased by thousands of fold since that time. So they're just exponential increases in those disorders. And it's fairly similar for cancer. So we could talk about that too, if you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to learn more about that. And how did you go about, what were some of the sources you were using, and how did you narrow in on seed oils as being one of the main culprits?
Yeah, well, I found that, quite frankly, if I went to the open internet, for the most part, or even looked at books, this is back before about 2013 or 2015, I just felt like I was pulled in so many different directions. And so most all of my investigation to this day has been based on the published scientific literature. Coupled with some foundational basis from researchers like primarily Weston A. Price and Lauren Cordain and other so-called paleo kinds of researchers. So all of that evidence is what was my guiding light, if you will. And but I primarily stick to the published science to try to prove to myself or prove a point about any condition.
And do you feel like this was completely absent from your education as a physician? Like, why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's a great question, Scott. And this was absolutely 100% absent from all of my education. I didn't learn any of this in college. I didn't learn. I don't think we literally even had 5 minutes worth of nutrition education in medical school. I went to the University of Colorado School of Medicine, 1986 to 1990, here in Denver, and yeah, I don't believe there was any education whatsoever on nutrition. And if there was any, Scott, I'm pretty certain it would have been wrong. There might have been a smidgen of teaching about saturated fat, yeah, but I honestly don't recall that. So again, I mean, my belief system was the same as everybody else's. I mean, everybody that followed, the traditional, typical dogma that, fat back in those days, I thought fat was bad. Saturated fat is bad. Saturated fat drives cholesterol, and cholesterol drives heart disease. And that's all I really, that's all I believed at that point. And so, yeah, I didn't have any of this education whatsoever. So my medical background certainly does give me a leg up in terms of understanding the deeper science. Of course, it's probably easier for me than somebody who's not a physician to understand metabolic pathways, to some degree. But I really think that all of this really can be learned by anyone. And I don't think that, that we have to get into the weeds so much to understand the big picture. And I'm really a big picture guy, Scott. I don't really dive deeply into biochemistry and pathophysiology at the molecular level unless I have to. I try to keep it at a higher level, because most of us, that's what we need. And I think even including physicians and even PhD researchers, I think that's what we need big picture evidence. We need to connect what's happening at the population level, to get at what's driving a lot of this chronic obesity and chronic disease. And because you cannot do it by beginning at the micro level. You can't begin by looking at metabolic pathways and cellular metabolism. You're completely lost. You're in the forest. So I believe in sticking to the big picture. And when I've presented to smaller audiences that have no bent, if you will, they're not low carb, they're not low fat, they're not carnivore, they're not vegan, they're just your typical average American or Canadian omnivores, for example. This kind of evidence is they find extremely powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd love to hear, your high level take. How do vegetables and processed foods destroy our health?
Yeah. So if we just look at the really 50,000-foot view of processed foods and chronic disease, processed foods really, I define as containing four things. It's refined flours, refined sugars, vegetable oils, and trans fats. And then you'll have all these mystery ingredients that really don't probably have all that big of an impact. It's really the others, the primary components that are the big problem, because there's two problems with these. They're nutrient deficient and they're toxic. And the toxicity, I believe, is primarily driven by the vegetable oils. And so, how do they do that? Well, so the vegetable oils are high in omega-6 fatty acids. Primarily, that's linoleic acid is the primary omega-6 fat. That accounts for about 80, approximately more like 90% of the omega-6 that we would consume. And that omega-6 accumulates in our bodies based on whatever the relative proportion of that fat is in your dietary fat. And as it accumulates, it sets up a biological milieu that leads to an environment that's pro-oxidative, pro-inflammatory, toxic, and nutrient deficient. And I always say is you put those four pillars of hazard together, and you have the recipe for metabolic disaster. And so vegetable oils, which did not exist in most any population worldwide up through the American Civil War ending in 1865, they were unknown, and they were introduced in the United States with cottonseed oil just after the American Civil War ended in about 1866, and then manufacturers added soybean oil in 1909, and then there was just a landslide after that, and we got all the others. So now today we have soybean, corn, canola, cottonseed, rapeseed, grapeseed, sunflower, safflower, rice bran, sesame, and peanut oils. Those are the primary what most people would call seed oils, and they come from seeds except for soybeans, which is of course a bean. So these are very, very high in omega-6 fat. They contain more than 20% omega-6 fat by mass. And if you contrast that to natural animal fats from animals that are raised on their natural ancestral diets, those animals like, beef, chicken, and pork, for example, would have 2 to 2.5% omega-6 linoleic acid in comparison to the 20% plus that's in the vegetable oil. So the vegetable oils range from about a low of around, and I'm talking seed oils here, a low of around 20% in canola oil up to a high of about 78% in safflower oil. Soybean oil is around 54 to 56%. You can contrast that with olive oil that averages about 10%. So you want to have in your diet, all the evidence that I've looked at, Scott, shows me that in ancestral diets that don't have seed oils, of course, none of them possibly could, because no ancestrally living population ever had seed oils in their diet. Their omega-6 consumption is under 2% of their total calories, and it's generally under 1.7%. And whereas westernized populations with seed oils are now consuming generally anywhere between 6 and 12% of their diet as omega-6 fat, omega-6 linoleic acid alone. And so again, that accumulates in the body fat and sets up this disastrous environment for all of this chronic disease and obesity, overweight and obesity. Did I answer your question there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Did I? Okay. I wasn't sure if I got off track there.
No, that's perfect. And like, why do you think seed oils, I think it's really interesting that things that can attack parts of, for lack of a better word, attack or impair parts of our biology and cause many different diseases. I think it's really interesting how that works, how it's not like seed oils just cause this one thing. Why is that? Why is it so ubiquitous or so damaging in multiple ways and leading to multiple disease states?
Right. That's a perfect question too, Scott. And the answer to that really is because seed oils and high omega-6 diets are chronic metabolic poisons. So these are chronic metabolic biological poisons at that level. And you have to understand that any given nutrient is, has a sweet spot of consumption where it's, all of these things are required. It doesn't matter what you're looking at, whether it's, it's oxygen, water, or magnesium, or zinc, or iron, or any fatty acid. They all have a range which the consumption is appropriate and good. And if you're below that, there's problems. And if you're above that, there's problems. And at a certain point, everything becomes toxic. I mean, oxygen at extreme high levels, for a day is severely toxic. It creates extreme oxidation. And so vegetable oils, when we consume these and they accumulate in our body fat, I think if we all have the same diet, then we're still all going to get all these different diseases. And the reason for that is genetic susceptibility primarily, I believe. I mean, there's just thousands and thousands of other factors when you start looking at all of the complexities. But the bottom line is that we do have genetic susceptibility. So that if you and I consume the same diet for 4 years, you might have a heart attack. I might end up with cancer. And the next person who consumed the same diet might end up with macular degeneration. And the next one would end up with Alzheimer's disease. Right? And that's because, again, goes back to genetic susceptibility. So I like the old adage that genetics loads the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. And that environment, to me, is well over 99% diet. You could talk about stress and lack of sleep and grounding and so many factors. But I think the primary factors really that hold the great amount of weight is the diet. Because if you look at, hunter-gatherers, can live a very stressful life. 19th century Americans didn't have any of these diseases, but it's not as though they didn't have stress. We know they did. And, all populations have had stress, but they didn't end up with all of these diseases. They didn't have Alzheimer's disease or dementia, and they weren't having heart attacks, and they didn't have macular degeneration. And why were their cancer levels so extraordinarily low? Well, the same that you see in all populations that don't consume these processed foods, and they all share the same things in common. They don't have, for one major thing, they don't have refined vegetable oils, seed oils in their diet, and they have a low omega-6 consumption. So again, we could go back out to the big picture for just a moment. When you put together the high omega-6 along with processed foods that are nutrient deficient, now you have two primary problems all coming together at the same time. You've got nutrient deficiency and toxicity, and so that is driving all of this. It's driving obesity, it's driving chronic disease, essentially. And that's the worst case scenario. Poor lack of nutrients. In other words, lack of vitamins and micronutrients. I'm talking about lack of vitamins and minerals, and then the toxicity of a high omega-6 diet. And that's exactly what westernized diets do.
And in contrast, how does our physiology respond to other sources of fat, saturated, and can you also talk about monounsaturated fats?
Yeah, sure. So the fats that we normally would get in any natural diet are going to be composed primarily of saturated and monounsaturated fats, right? So if you look at a steak or just hamburger meat, the bulk of that is going to be monounsaturated fat, just slightly outnumbering saturated fat, right? Typically, it's going to be something like that. They're almost equivalent. And then you're going to have a very small proportion that's the polyunsaturated fat. And that would be the omega-6 and omega-3s. And those are going to be about 2 or 3% of the total in any animal. And so this is what is in a natural diet, and this is what works perfectly, right? That you have a very low consumption of the polyunsaturated fatty acids, the omega-6 and omega-3s, in my view, You can get a lot more omega-3 when you're consuming seafood, and that works great, right? That's not a problem. And but anyway, before I get off track here, so in your physiology, if you think about, well, what happens if you have almost no fat, for example, like if you have a diet like the Papua New Guineans of Tukasinta, who consumed 3% fat, which is an extraordinarily small amount. Their diet was 94.6% carbohydrate. It was almost all sweet potatoes. They would occasionally feast on pork and chicken. You think, well, then what happens there? Well, when you don't have when you can't burn the carbohydrates for fuel or store them as glycogen, they are preferentially converted, number one, to saturated fat, and number two, to monounsaturated fat. So that tells you something. I think for the most part, is if you're feeding your body naturally, your body doesn't convert anything to a substance that's inappropriate for us, as a general rule of thumb. So it tells me a lot that our bodies would preferentially produce saturated fat as opposed to anything else, out of excess carbohydrate. So if you consume too much sugar, too many, your diet is all sweet potatoes or all bread, for example, and it's exceedingly low in any saturated or monounsaturated fats, for example, you're going to make those. And so but we don't make omega-6 and we don't make omega-3. We cannot make, let me rephrase that. We cannot make omega-6 LA, linoleic acid, the primary omega-6, and we can't make omega-3 ALA, alpha-linolenic acid, the primary omega-3, right? So we can make the longer chain versions of those if we're given LA and ALA. But anyway, I hope did that also answer that question,
absolutely.
Scott? Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. And what happens when we consume, like, should we be, I guess natural question is, like, what should we be consuming based on your research? Should we be balancing saturated and monounsaturated? Should we be primarily consuming saturated fat? Because you said that's the first thing that we convert carbohydrates to, and what's your justification?
Yeah, I think that you can, in terms of well, first of all, if we look at the really big picture, if we look at macronutrient ratios, based on everything that I see, Scott, I make a strong case for this in my presentations. I don't think macronutrient ratios really matter all that much. And this goes clear back to Weston A. Price's research in the 1930s. If you look at all these populations, and I go to great lengths in this new book that's called The Ancestral Diet Revolution, that I go to great lengths to show that, you have populations like the Maasai of Kenya and Tanzania, their diet is almost exclusively milk, meat, and blood from the cattle they herd. So they're pastoralists. And their diet is 66% animal fat. That's almost all coming from a very high fat milk. Their cattle produce very high fat milk. So 66% animal fat, that diet is about 40 to 46% saturated fat. And yet they have no heart disease. They have no diabetes. They have no obesity, right? They're extremely healthy people. But and again, their carbohydrate was about 14%. So that leaves about 20% of their diet as protein, right? And then if you look at, and I've talked about like the Tok allowance, for example, their diet is a little lower in fat. I think it was about 53 or 56% fat, but that's a right at 50% saturated fat coming from coconut oil, which is almost, again, coconut oil is about 91 to 95% saturated. That's why their diet is extremely high saturated fat. So they would have more carbohydrate in their diet. I can't remember exactly what that number is. But again, that diet also worked perfectly. They had no obesity, no diabetes, no heart disease. You look at the Papua New Guineans of Tukasinta, their diet being almost more than 90% sweet potatoes. Their diet is 94.6% carbohydrate, 3% fat, 2.4% protein. Yet they're very healthy by our standards. They did have dental decay and they had arthritis that was very significant. Again, I think because their animal fat consumption was far too low. They're almost vegans, and so I think they're missing fat soluble vitamins there for one thing. The Okinawans are used as an example. They're very similar in this regard. Their traditional diet was in 1950s to 60 was 84% carbohydrate, which was almost all sweet potatoes, very much like the Papua New Guineans of Tukasinta. Their diet was 5% fat, and so the rest would be protein, which would leave them about 11% protein, which was coming mostly from pork. So the Okinawans' traditional diet for hundreds of years, this is well documented, was sweet potatoes and pork and vegetables. That was basically it. That's what they lived off of. And the mainland Japanese, their diet is really similar. It's almost identical traditionally up through 1960, 84% carbohydrate, the macronutrients virtually identical, 5% fat, and their diet was 80% white rice with vegetables and fish primarily. That's what their traditional diet was. But yet we know all these populations are fantastically healthy. So you don't have to have a whole bunch of saturated fat. As I said, if you don't get hardly any, your body will just make it out of the carbohydrates. As long as there's enough there to store some fuel, and it's going to make fat for you, and it'll preferentially store saturated fat, with monounsaturated fat being second. So even if your diet is 3% fat, which is, I just think, it's way, way, way too low. But even in the most extreme circumstance, the population, the Papua New Guineans were healthy. And obviously the Okinawans have, a history of being, the longest surviving people on the planet. They were exceedingly healthy in the 1950s and 1960, before what happened to them. They westernized their diet. Began with with American occupation after World War II. We began to westernize their diet. They had hamburgers and French fries for the first time, shortly after after World War II. So anyway, I don't think it matters. I don't think you have to get a lot of saturated fat or monounsaturated, or even really worry about the ratios, as long as your foods are natural. And vegetable oils, at least the industrial seed oils, they are not natural. They're not a natural part of any diet, period.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what should we do? Your book is titled How Vegetable Oils and Processed Foods Destroy Our Health and How to Recover. Can you expand more on the recovery part?
Yes.
You kind of talked about it a bit throughout the interview, but I'd love to hear more.
Yes. So the first thing that people have to know is that this is not a quick fix. I think if you have been consuming what I would call a westernized diet or a processed food laden diet for years, you will have high omega-6 in your body fat. And we can come back to that, Scott, and talk about those numbers. But the half-life of any fatty acid in your body fat is about 600 to 680 days. So linoleic acid in your body fat, again, think of this, the half-life is about 2 years. And I used to maybe mistakenly state that, in pharmacology, we know that it takes 5 half-lives to remove anything from your body. But the good news is that it's not 5 half-lives when it comes to your fatty acids. There's one paper that strongly suggests that you can turn over all of your fatty acids in 3 years. So 100% of your body fat will be turned over in 3 years. So this means today, if you've been consuming a diet that's typical of Americans, which was 11.8% omega-6 linoleic acid in the diet as of 2008, and you'll have a very high body fat linoleic acid, that will start to come down as you drop your consumption down to ancestral levels, which would be around 1 or 2%, and then and you will become healthier that literally that day. And I can come back to reasons why, but you'll change your blood components of inflammatory mediators that day, and then gradually your body fat, which means it's the storage depot for these fatty acids, plus all of your cells and cellular membranes, they're all going to reflect those same fatty acid components, and those will gradually come down over time. And there's so much evidence that I see of people having tremendous benefits in their health just in a few weeks' time or a few months' time. Tremendous weight loss, tremendous improvements in inflammatory factors, and just people feeling better by getting their omega-6 down to a natural level, which is under 2% consumption.
And you talked earlier about at the beginning about cancer specifically.
Mm-hmm.
How can vegetable oils and processed foods directly contribute to cancer?
So I think that the short answer is that seed oils and high omega-6 diets, they drive mitochondrial dysfunction, period. And the way that they do that is by disrupting a molecule called cardiolipin in the inner mitochondrial membrane where the electron transport chain exists. And this causes a breakdown in the ability of the inner mitochondrial membrane to hold a proton gradient, because as you consume more and more omega-6, this causes what I call a catastrophic lipid peroxidation cascade. And one of the pieces of that cascade is the oxidation of the fatty acid molecules in cardiolipin. And what happens there is that this cardiolipin then can no longer hold a proton gradient, which is where you gain power from in the mitochondria. So the basic answer is you get broken mitochondria and you can't properly produce energy. And when you can't produce energy, you fall apart at the cellular level. Yeah, and I tell people it's the same as when when you're so sick that you can't get out of bed, you can't take care of your house. All of the housekeeping functions, your ability to cook and clean and fix your house and replace windows or whatever it is that you need to do, all that falls apart, right? You can't accomplish anything if you're so sick you can't get out of bed. And this is really what we're doing to our cells, is we're making them sick with this high omega-6. Well, so when you have mitochondrial dysfunction as a result of this energy production failure caused by high omega-6 consumption, then you have the downstream effects are multifold. Just everything goes wrong then. So the first thing that happens is you get increased reactive oxygen species, which fuels more fire. This creates even more problems. The second thing that happens is that the cell becomes insulin resistant at the cellular level. And so the insulin resistance leads to all of this, increasing blood sugar and, fatty liver disease, ultimately type 2 diabetes, all that. The loss of energy ultimately leads to defects in our DNA and RNA, so or at least in our chromosomes. So now this is where you start getting mutations and so forth in your somatic cells, in your body's cells. So again, those are downstream effects, just as I'm sure you've heard, that cancer is a metabolic disease. Well, this is why, because this is one of the major mechanisms, is this high omega-6, and this is proven. So let me tell you about that for just a moment, Scott, because you were asking about cancer. Well, back in 1989, Clement Ip, IP is the spelling of his last name, this well-known researcher, published studies on rats where he exposed them, or rats or mice, I can't remember, but exposed them to a carcinogen, DMBA, but he put them then on different diets that began at 0.5% omega-6 linoleic acid, which is ancestral, right? Anything below 2%. So that was, 0.5%. And then he increased the omega-6 consumption in their diets at 0.5% increments, and I think went up to about 12%, which would be typical of Americans today. And what he showed was that, again, after exposure to a carcinogen and these different diets, that the cancer went up and up like this, up until the diet reached 4.4% omega-6 linoleic acid, and then it leveled off the cancer rates, right? And the cancer was mammary tumors. Well, mammary tumors in rodents are the same thing as breast cancer in humans. And so these animals had increasing cancer rates again until they reached 4.4% omega-6 linoleic acid. Then it kind of leveled off, and there wasn't that much of an increase. So this shows a threshold effect for cancer. So this is with regard to linoleic acid. And so if you look at all these population studies, and they say, well, people who consume more seed oils are not getting more cancer than those who consume less. The reason for that is because everybody's consuming too much. We've been over 4.4% linoleic acid probably since 1960, right? And this is the problem. We went over this a long time ago, and almost all westernized countries are higher than 4.4% omega-6 linoleic acid. The average now is 6 to 12%. So let's go back just for a minute. So we modeled American diets in 1865 before there was any seed oils in the diet, and that omega-6 consumption was about 1.1% of the diet. It was about 2.2 to 2.6 grams of linoleic acid. All right, so we that number increased to around 2.2%, if I recall, by 1909, the omega-6 LA in the American diet. By 1999, we were at 7-point-something% of the diet, I believe it was. And by 2008, we were at 11.8% of the diet as omega-6 LA, right? So we went from about 1.1% up to 11.8% over a period of about 140 years. So this is a 12-fold increase in omega-6 LA, whether you look at it by mass or by percentage. And this is the recipe for disaster. And everywhere we've looked, we see the same exact scenario. It's just a matter of degree. More omega-6, more disaster, more cancer, more heart disease, more obesity, more Alzheimer's, more macular degeneration, you name it, you get it. That's what happens.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I had no idea that the increase was that drastic, and that study with the gradient increases is really, really cool. Well, Chris, I could talk to you all day about this, but this has been an awesome introduction and overview on omega-6. Where can people find you, find out more about you, and follow along with some of your work?
Yeah, so, we have two nonprofit foundations, Cure AMD Foundation, that's for age-related macular degeneration, Cure AMD Foundation. And then we started Ancestral Health Foundation. It does not have a website, but will very, very soon. So that'll be at ancestralhealthfoundation.org, and Cure AMD Foundation is at cureamd.org. You can find me on YouTube. This book, and I have a copy of it here. Scott, I can show, I guess, no, because I'm using that funny background. I guess it doesn't really show up very well. That's too bad. Well,
I'll have a link to it.
It's called the Ancestral Diet Revolution. Should be available right about May 15th or so, and be in at almost all online book retailers like Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and so forth.
Excellent. Well, I'll have links to all of that in the show notes as well. And thank you so much for your time today, Chris. It's been awesome. I've learned a ton, and I'm sure the audience has as well.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate it. It's been an honor.
Thank you for listening to the show. You can find The Scott Mize Show on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Please leave a comment, like, review, or share the podcast with your friends or followers. It helps more people find the show.